I'm Chris. I've got the post-lunch slot, so I hope you all had loads of fruit and are feeling energised. I am Director of Digital at SCVO, which I'm sure most of you know is Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. So for the benefit of those who don't know about us, we are a membership body for civil society organisations in Scotland. We've got 1,700 members, something like that. I never know the exact figure. But everything from large national organisations down through the long tail of community groups. Some of those registered charities, some of them not registered charities, a sort of glorious mess of third sector activity. The stuff that I do is about digital. A lot of that is digital inclusion. So I do lots of work with organisations across Scotland trying to help get more people online, help people use the web, use digital tools, because we think that's hugely important in terms of improving people's life chances. Some of what we do is about helping third sector organisations to boost their digital capability. So I'm in the camp that says actually, while there's some great stuff going on, there are too many charities and voluntary organisations in Scotland that aren't using digital tools and technologies as effectively as they could be. And that part of that is about taking cost out, but a lot of it is about actually doing a better job with limited resources. And so we'll come back and touch on that. And then I also look after some of SCVO's data infrastructure. We tend to know quite a lot about the sector, or at least we think we do, because of our membership, because of the networks we work with, because of the resources we invest in analysing the data about the sector. And we're trying to be smarter about what we do with that and get more value from it. So that's most of what I'll talk about, but I think what we'll find is all these things are connected, right? Because you can't do lots of the work with data and analysis unless you've got good digital skills. And sometimes to do that, you need to think about investing in the people in your organisations as well as the platforms and the software. This isn't going to be a super technical talk because I'm not a super technical guy, but I'll show you a few pictures as we go. We'll sort of start a conversation and then let's sort of spend maybe half of the time me letting you digest your lunch and giving you an overview, and then the other half we can open it up for a bit of a conversation in the room about some of the things that I raise. Right, so I guess we'll try and cover these three big themes, right? The first is from a kind of practitioner policy point of view, where does all this data and evidence that we've been talking about actually fit in? Why do I care about data? Why do I care about understanding what's going on? And a big part of the answer there is going to be about actually what's our interaction with the policy-making process. And government, Scottish government, UK government talks about evidence-based policy-making, right? Let's have the information so we can make good decisions. And I think there's a role for all of us to make sure that we actually are providing some of the inputs to that so that it's done well. I'll talk a bit about how we're using data at SCVO and some of the things that we're trying to do, some of the insights that we're uncovering, little peek into how some of the things that we use are structured, because that might be interesting to you, or it might not. We'll find out. And then I talk a lot about where I would like to take this agenda and where SCVO sees some of this going. And I'd love a bit of feedback from you about if this is the right direction, what else you'd like to see us doing, partnerships we should be forging with others, that sort of thing. But we'll start at the top, right? So all this evidence-based policymaking data, why do we want it? Here's a good quote. W. Edwards Deming was an American statistician, professor, engineer, management consultant, all of these things. I kind of like that. I mean, that's sort of my perspective on this stuff. You can have all the assertion and anecdote that you like, and I certainly found since I started this job at SCVO, I get hit with anecdotes all of the time. People tell me about the person they met or the organisation they worked with or the fantastic example of a brilliant thing, and I love it all, and it's amazing. But it's not enough when I need to go and stand and talk to the minister or the business leader or whoever and convince them to back what I need to do. It kind of gets me into the conversation, but it never closes it. And one of the big things that I find I lack in the world of digital inclusion, but I think it's writ large across the sector, is its lack of hard data about what the impact is of the interventions that we try to do. So why, when we think about this, and I have these conversations with people about the importance of data for civil society. And people say, well, we don't need the data, we just need to know that we're doing a good thing, and good things are important to do. These are the sorts of questions which I think you can't really understand without a good grip on the data about your organisation. Let's say you want to know who's actually involved in the things that we do, right? I sort of know intuitively that I use volunteers and I work with a certain group in society and I've got these sorts of partnerships. But could you actually do a total map of all the people's lives that you touch, all the people that you work with, all the people that you need to stay in touch with, the people you need to keep updated? What are we good and bad at? Now, we often like to think that we know what we're good and bad at, and again, we have an intuitive sense of the areas where we get a good return and the areas where we don't get a good return. But the truth is, and I see this day to day in digital inclusion work, actually, we don't know what we're really good at, and we don't know which interventions are failing because we don't collect enough of the data about the outcomes in a systematic way. And if you were in a commercial organisation, my sense is, not always, but my sense is on average you'd have a sharper understanding of what you're good and bad at, because if you were only doing bad stuff, you wouldn't be in business very long. It's kind of this tension between wanting to expose the truth about what we're doing versus sometimes protecting all the things that we've built up over years and years and years. And sometimes what we find, and I've seen this when you look in organisations, is that we started doing things for the best of intentions, and they were very effective when they started. And actually, we're kind of nervous, right, about opening up and having a bit of transparency about today, in 2014, is the activity that we're working on really the best way to solve the problem that we say we care about? So, these are deep questions, right, but you've got to ask them. When will the money run out? That's quite a pertinent one for lots of us. Actually, particularly now, we're all struggling against austerity, against massive pressure on the financial situation in our organisations. And again, sometimes we like to say, well, the important thing is the job that we're doing and we don't want to be driven by the finances and we're not geared to make a profit and so on and so forth. And all of that is right. But you can't ignore the day-to-day questions about practicalities and finance. Where should we invest? Again, if you're going to make some big bets about how the future of your organisation is going to look, then you need to have decent evidence on where you're going to get the best return. And maybe this is particularly live at the moment, given all the discussions about further devolution. How is government policy affecting us? And again, I sort of get the impression that we're good at intuitively understanding this stuff. We know we've got strong opinions about public policy, about the rights and wrongs of different bits of public service delivery and so on and so forth. But I don't meet many organisations that can tell me in really crunchy detail how a particular policy change would affect their business, what would it mean for staffing numbers and my ability to deliver, or the number of people that I could reach. All of these sorts of big strategic questions are much easier to handle with a wee bit of data and evidence to back up your arguments. Now, that's probably all self-evident, but I just make the point that even if we in this room understand this, we've got to be out there evangelizing for all the people that we interact with, because not everybody is in the same place. So here's a chart. Some of you will have seen this chart. It's a lovely SCVO chart. My colleague Ilse at the back gives a wave. And her colleagues are responsible for some of the work that we do in terms of understanding the size and shape of the third sector in Scotland. And I think, for me, right, so this is the chart of what's the total income of third sector organisations in Scotland and how does it break down? And it's got everything on there: social care, law advocacy, housing, health, so on and so forth. There's some numbers on there. It tells you the total figure, which is £4.9 billion worth of income in 2014. And I almost think, right, so it's an enormous piece of work to pull this together, and I'll talk about some of the data sources that go into it and so on and so forth. And there's a whole report that we publish on it which breaks it down and cuts it different ways, and it's well worth getting hold of if you want to have an explore around the data. For me, this does two important things, though. One is it gives us a number. Now, 4.9 billion in the middle, we could probably have a whole day's workshop on, is it really 4.9 billion? Or is it 4.8 billion? Or is it 5.1? And what should you count? And where are the cutoffs? And where are the boundaries? And probably be worth doing. But if you put yourself in the heads of the politicians and some of the people that we engage with, whether it's 4.9 or 5.1 or whatever, it doesn't really matter. The point is it's a number, and that's disproportionately powerful compared to a conversation where I show up and say, the third sector is really important. You wouldn't believe how powerful it is to have a number. And people quote this number back at us all the time, and it's referenced in parliamentary debates, and you see it in the news. And it's important because it gives us traction. And it's important that it's robust and that we've got some confidence that it roughly is 4.9, but it doesn't matter that it's exactly 4.9. So that's one thing, right? You need a number to anchor the conversation, and you might think that that's a sad indictment on society and the ability of our politicians to have a good debate and so on and so forth, but it's the truth, right? And if we're going to operate in this environment, then sometimes you need those kind of talisman numbers. And the second thing I think is really important is that it starts a conversation. So again, we could have loads of debate off the back of this about why do some of those segments appear larger than others, or what's going inside here, or how come social care is so big by value, but how does that relate to whether the proportion of people engaged in that, or how does that relate to what do you think about outcomes and life chances rather than income, and so on and so forth. And again, having this information there lets you start that conversation in a much more structured way, because here's a bunch of stuff that you can agree with or disagree with, or ask actually, how is that made up, or how did you get to that conclusion? And I personally would like to see a lot more charts like this that start those conversations. And for what it's worth, actually, the pictures, we get our infographics people to do these, work a hell of a lot better than just shoving a table of numbers in front of people. Right, so there's some sort of lessons in there about presentation. So, we do this stuff because we care and because we're interested in what's going on, but also because we want to exercise a lot of influence over the policy debate. And having these facts and figures at our fingertips, we find makes that much, much easier. Yeah, of course.
The economic contribution, in light of what Mr. was talking about, the volunteer paid staff, is that taken into account in the economic contribution, or is it purely about revenue?
Really good question. So I think it's about revenue and income, but also, do you want to...
Right, so there's nothing about contribution of volunteers /
So not in that particular chart, because this is just about income flowing in. I think if you look at the longer report, there's sort of different cuts of data that we use to go into this.
So in other words, you could argue that economic contribution isn't the right title for this.
Yeah, you could, yeah. Well, exactly.
I'm saying it should be about the income of the...
Yeah, really good. Yeah, but you're right, absolutely. And how much of this is about, how much of this are we going to have the debate on other people's terms, and how much are we going to have the debate on our terms? And, that's one of these lines that we always tread, because on the one hand, you want to adopt the language and the structures that will resonate with some of the people outside our sector that you want to influence. On the other hand, actually, some of this stuff is not fit for purpose for us, because we think in a different or additional way, and teasing all that stuff out, I think is a really, really important point. Here are some of the places that we get some of the data from that goes into that sort of exercise. So this is not an exhaustive set, and you'll know about all of these things as well as I do, but for completeness, there's all the sort of official stuff from the regulators. So Oscar obviously knows loads about the regulated charity sector. Is there someone from Oscar here? Hello. Welcome, Oscar. We know from the Financial Conduct Authority, or formerly Financial Services Authority, things about the regulatory filings in terms of organisations' finances. Scottish Housing Regulator tells us things about the housing sector, so on and so forth. So there's all those sort of official sets of data that we can try to access. And some of that requires phoning up and asking very nicely, and eventually the data comes back in heaps of paper. And more likely, you go on the website and you pull the spreadsheets down and this sort of thing. And if you're super lucky because it's 2014, someone's provided an open data endpoint and you connect your thing to it and suck the data down in real time. So there's all of that happening, and I'll talk a bit more about the technology later. Organisations like ours know quite a lot about what's happening in the sector by virtue of being membership organisations or being network organisations. So as I said, SCVO has got 1,700 member organisations. We know a little bit about all of those members because they pay subscriptions, although we waive it for the smaller ones. And we're in contact with those organisations. We collect a bit of data about them. So we can look at those sorts of registers that we hold. And those of you who know lots about the way the sector is structured will know that SCVO works with the Third Sector Interface Network to help those organisations collect more data about what's going on in their local area. So we provide a platform, basically a CRM platform, over the web. The Third Sector Interfaces use that to track what's happening in their area. And we can aggregate some of that to get a view of all the civil society activity across Scotland. So actually that data set spans about 30, 35, 40,000 organisations in Scotland, not just registered charities, but also other voluntary and community organisations that are doing something in this sort of messy realm that we describe as civil society. And I'll give you a peek into the data structure for that in a minute. And then when we need to, we put bits of work in the field. We do panel surveys. Some of these run on a regular basis. Sometimes we put ad hoc things out when we need to know certain things about what's going on. At the moment, I'm thinking about whether we need to put something in the field around understanding digital in the third sector in Scotland a bit better. Because sometimes, actually, you look around and you see that all the official regulatory data and all the things that we've captured for other reasons doesn't quite answer my question. I need to ask some different questions in order to get the answers that will be illuminating for me. That sometimes is difficult because it can be bloody expensive, but not always, and there are ways to do some of the stuff with modern technology that let you around some of those issues. Right, so I promised you a peek into the data structure. This is for the really geeky people. So this platform that I mentioned about third sector interfaces and what sorts of data do we collect, or do they collect, and we can look at. This is the sort of thing that we know about. So we know about organisations, be they regulated charities or other third sector organisations, and a bit of profile data, right? What are they called? What's their mission statement? Where are they? What's their phone number? What's their Twitter handle? This sort of stuff. We know about some of the people that work in those organisations. Not all the people that work in them, but we've got a contact point for pretty much all of them. And we know a little bit about how many people work there and that sort of thing, where it's disclosed in different reports and accounts. And because lots of the things that we do are geared towards volunteering and voluntary action in this space, we know of those organisations in Scotland's third sector, what opportunities do they have for people to go and volunteer with them. We do a little bit of tracking around actually who is volunteering to be placed on those volunteering opportunities, and we do a little bit of mapping about where are those connections, what are people actually going to do in communities with voluntary organisations. And because this is a CRM platform, the third sector interfaces also use this for a little bit of management of what they call episodes and interactions. So essentially the relationship the TSI has with some of those voluntary organisations. Now, I've just oversimplified that massively, and not all TSIs use this in the same way, and the data is much more complex under the hood than the chart here. But I'm just trying to give you a sense of the sorts of things that we know about, and therefore the sorts of questions that we can ask, right? Because armed with actually this not particularly complicated set of data, albeit there are 900 fields behind some of these and it's not all filled in. We can start to do some high-level stuff about actually what's the shape of the sector, not based on a sample of our members, but actually based on the full data set. And you can ask some questions about how is this changing over time. If I look back historically, what does the composition of different sorts of activities look like and how is it varying? I could cross-tab that with geography and figure out whether health and social care is getting bigger in some places and smaller in others. And all of this starts to get us closer to answers that leaders in our sector need to know about, right? If you're facing pressure on health and social care services in Glasgow, then a bit of data about which organisations are involved in this, are they growing or shrinking, and which have been born or died in the last year, is a powerful piece of evidence to help you understand what's going on. And we're, I think, getting to the point where we've got a lot of this data. We haven't always been brilliant, frankly, at getting the insights off the back of it. And certainly my sort of perspective on this is that lots of people out there in all of our networks spend a lot of time under the burden of data entry. Right? We've got to capture the information, we need to know what's going on. And the balance is a long way off where it should be in terms of actually using that data to answer questions. And so it's sort of incumbent upon some of us to make all of this a bit easier so that you spend less time entering the data and more time figuring out what question you want to ask the data and using the tools to get some answers quickly. So, with that sort of motivation in mind, we do a couple of things with this at the moment in terms of connecting this to the outside world. So all of those volunteering opportunities that I mentioned actually get exposed to the public through the Volunteer Scotland website. Someone from Volunteer Scotland here? Yep, hello. Right, so Volunteer Scotland takes a feed of data from the database that I just mentioned in terms of volunteering opportunities. You've got some additional information on volunteering opportunities in something called Volunteering Zone, which is about national organisations rather than local organisations. And you bring that together on a web page so that the public can understand what volunteering opportunities are there out there and how do I find the ones near me. That's roughly it, isn't it? Yeah. So I think that might be a slightly old version of the web page because there's some whizzier stuff now. But we're getting closer to saying not just I know where all the volunteering opportunities are, but actually let's make that available so that people can actually go and do some volunteering, right? Rather than just know about it and be very pleased with ourselves for knowing about it. And at the moment, we expose some of the organisational data on a website called Get Involved. This is a pretty hacky alpha version of a site, to be honest with you. But what you can do on here is pop in a postcode or a charity number or a keyword, and it will look through all of the entities in that chart that I showed you a couple of screens ago and tell you which organisations in the sector match those criteria. And that's just, you can see that's just the sort of beginnings of an inkling of let's find a way for people to connect with this data. But we thought actually giving people the opportunity to find things near them was a pretty good place to start. And you stand a better chance of finding support for one of your relatives who needs some care from a third sector organisation on here than you do Googling for it, perhaps. Don't know. But the more information we can make available to people, the better chances of connecting them with the places that matter. That's where we are. This is the sort of stuff which we're thinking about in terms of the future, and I think is really, really exciting. So, the first is starting to do better links between some of these platforms. So I told you about how we collect with the TSIs all this data about local third sector activity, and we link it to Volunteer Scotland, and we link it to Get Involved. Very interested in how we can make a better job of connecting more of these things together, because Volunteer Scotland and Get Involved are not the limits of third sector people in Scotland doing stuff with data. So someone from the Alliance is here. Where have you gone? Yep, a few people. So the Alliance, amongst other things, has this platform called Alice, which is about mapping health and social care assets. Working with the Alliance and others to figure out how do we connect some of this together so that people looking for health and social care support can find community assets that have been mapped through Alice and other things, but also third sector organisations with the data collected from some of our platforms and so on and so forth. You can think about connections to local government data, public sector data, all of this stuff. I kind of sometimes stand here and have these conversations about, people say to me, well, what will we get out of all of this? And I often say, well, I don't know, but that's the whole point, right? If I knew what could be generated, then I'd be going and building it. But actually the best thing to do is to start to connect it together, because that way we'll discover how you use the data to meet people's needs. So there's something about connecting all this together. There's a big bit, as I alluded to earlier, about making the data easier to work with. So the sort of historic model of publish the spreadsheets, do a lovely PDF of my table of all the rows of data and stuff, whilst important, I think is not the end game for us. So I'm very interested in how do we publish more data, or the things that we know, the things that other people tell us, in machine-readable formats so that it can be easily ingested in other platforms and reused, and putting more APIs, application programming interfaces in place so that people can connect to our data in real time and query and ask questions and not say, well, I've got this massive download from SCVO, but it's a year old and I don't know how much has changed. We ought to be eliminating all those sorts of things, because actually it is 2014 and we can't always afford the bulletproof, gold-plated, super whizzy IT system, but some of the stuff is actually not that difficult or expensive to do. We just need to approach it slightly differently. And then I think more importantly, there's a couple of things in here. One about let's try to find some people to work with who will help us use this data to help people and communities participate better. So all this stuff, we collect it partly because we want to influence policymakers and partly because it's kind of interesting because we're in the sector, but most of it we want to know because we want to figure out how do we help more people engage with us? How do we help more people and more communities be involved in civil society, get the benefits of being supported by and working with and all of this lovely engagement that we are so keen on. And I genuinely believe that if you're going to do that at scale, then data and digital platforms and so on are the only way to pull that off. It's not that all the other stuff doesn't matter, but if you want to reach 5 million people, and if you want to create some really big conversations, then using the data that we've got available and the ability of the web and social media and so on to connect people together is going to be a huge part of the answer. And as our best chance at sort of, we have all this conversation at the moment about how do we maintain engagement in society, right? How do we see the spike in participation? How do we hold on to it? And this won't be the whole answer, but somewhere in here is a little bit of a contribution to an answer. And the last thing on that page is about innovation. So like I said before, I'm a big believer in opening up more of this content so that people can build things on top of it. If you look around other bits of our economy, you see plenty of places where organisations have started to open up their data for other people to build things on top of. And it's tremendously powerful. And people make things that the original organisation could never have dreamed of. There's a huge example of this in London where Transport for London opened up lots of their transport data, real-time information on buses and trains and tubes and stuff. All sorts of people build apps and products and services on top of that or integrate it with their own platform. You could have imagined most of that before they did it. In fact, they were overwhelmed by the demand and their servers all crashed and they had to pause it all and take stock and start again a few months later. But what's exciting is, we sometimes have this conversation with ourselves about we're very resource constrained, it's too difficult, we've got the day job to do, how do we ever find the time and the flexibility to think and be creative and be innovative? Part of the answer is there's a whole stack of people out there who will be innovative for us if we let them have access to some of the tools and the raw material they need to get going. And it's difficult and it's dangerous because you sacrifice some control over it, right? I'm going to put all this data out there and I don't know what people will do with it, and will they make an app that I don't really approve of, or will they try and monetize something that shouldn't be monetized, or what have you. I think there'll be a little bit of that. I personally think we can ride it out, and I think it would be a terrible shame to stifle all that innovation just in the interest of maintaining a lot of control over what people do with the data. Now, in terms of the future, here's the thing that I wonder, and this freaks my teams out when I say it to them, so we'll see how you get on. But everything that I've just described has been about, well, we'll effectively employ people to gather data and input it into my platform. And people might be in different places and be collecting slightly different things and inputting it in slightly different ways, but it's mostly the sort of traditional method of aggregate it all up, do panel surveys, try to ask all of our members, all this sort of stuff. These are two bits of work which I really recommend reading. I mean, they're interesting, but also probably for this audience, for the methodology as well, right? So one of these is a bit of work to understand what is the size and composition of the digital economy in the UK. This was done by NISA, National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and a company called Growth Intelligence. And this one is about the UK video game industry, done by Nesta and UKIE, which is UK Interactive Entertainment. And both of these are interesting because they try to discover the shape of the sector that they're interested in a very different way. So the digital economy one, the sort of motivation was, well, if you want to know how big the UK digital economy is, you've got to look at the standard industrial classification that the national statistics use to bucket all the different businesses in the country. And if you look in there and the codes go sort of they're, hierarchical, so you look inside the buckets and they subdivide and subdivide and subdivide. And you can try to kind of count all that, and there are statistical returns that people do and everything else. But a lot of people felt intuitively it wasn't giving them a very good handle on how big the digital economy was in the UK. How do you do better? Well, one answer is to hire more statisticians and make the panel bigger and so on and so forth. The other answer, which I think is kind of interesting, is let's try to look at all of the data exhaust that all these businesses generate. So it's 2014, internet's kind of everywhere, pretty much every business is online, not all of them, but pretty much. Probably every digital business is online, otherwise they've got a bit of a definition problem. So let's crawl the internet and look for all the ripples caused by the activity of British digital businesses, and let's use some machine learning to deduplicate and to spot what's referring to what and figure out what's timely and what's not. And we'll do it that way, like a kind of monster Google of UK digital economy. And that gives you some amazing insights because A, uses the complete data set, not a sample, and B, it's way more timely and way more targeted than anything that the Office for National Statistics could pull off doing it the traditional way. Whether it's right, I don't know. And again, we could have a whole one-day workshop to discuss the ins and outs of the approach, but it's interesting because it's a different way to uncover this stuff, and it pulls in things that wouldn't be seen by the statisticians or wouldn't be seen by the official channels. Similar idea for the stuff on video games. Again, you can ask, actually, let's look for all the ripples caused by these businesses or these organisations, and let's try to figure out then what that means about where they are and what they're up to. And I just wonder, could we pull off something similar for the third sector in Scotland, if not for the UK? We may or may not have the amazing computer programming expertise required right here in this room, but the proof of concept has been done. And you probably could look for all the ripples of all the different charity and voluntary organisations. Maybe not all of them, because we know actually more charities are offline than businesses. But imagine if you peeked in everything that Google knows about every website, and you peeked in all of the newspapers and data mined all the articles that mention a brilliant person and their anecdotes, which is where we started this conversation, right? All the anecdotes that are now living there somewhere in an article or a magazine or a website. Could you pull all that together? What would it tell us? Would it give us a better insight into all of this? I kind of suspect it would. I know that I haven't got the programming skills to pull it off, so if anyone else is interested in having a go, then we should have a conversation after this session. But maybe in a few years we could get towards that sort of place. Right, so I'm going to shut up now because you've all had time to digest your sandwiches and fruit, and open it up for a bit of questions and conversation. Like I say, I've kept it reasonably non-technical, but hopefully a little bit provocative. So I'd be really interested in your views on what I've said and your take on how we could do some of the stuff